Hello, this is Dr. Richard Olivas, and this is Society and Politics in the United States, 1800 to 1600, Part 2. Last time in Part 1, we began this lecture, and our thesis statement for that lecture and this lecture is the same, and it's on the screen. And it says, from 1800 to 1860, the United States experienced tremendous economic growth, but ethnic, racial, and religious diversity increasingly divided Americans, and the paths between the East, Northwest, and the South began to diverge or to go in different directions. So we'll start by reviewing some of the points that we looked at, excuse me, in the previous lecture. I may have to move this around a little bit so we can get the print here. We talked about Thomas Jefferson's vision of an agrarian republic that was based on the yeoman farmer being more important in the United States and having land. And we defined a yeoman farmer as a subsistence farmer who cultivated his own land, not a commercial farmer or a plantation master, who worked large tracts of land with slave labor. Instead, yeoman farmers were subsistence farmers, and that is, they're small farmers, and they possessed the values, it was believed, industry or hard work, thrift, concern for neighbors, that republics needed in their citizens. Why did Jefferson and his supporters believe that territorial expansion was necessary? Jeffersonians believe that concentrations of wealth could be minimized or reduced by rapid territorial expansion. That is, Jefferson believed that there was wealth and power, too much of it concentrated in large cities in the mercantile or the trading class of Americans. And he believed that giving people opportunities to farm and to own land would draw people away from the crowded areas of the East and preserve the social equality that Republican liberty required. So Jefferson set the nation on a path of territorial expansion. We talked last time about the expeditioners, Lewis and Clark, that the president sent to see if an overland route to the Pacific were possible. We also saw in the last lecture that Secretary of War Henry Knox was a very strong supporter of using treaties or agreements or contracts between the United States and Indian tribes to acquire land. We also saw that the United States began the process of what was called Indian removal, uprooting Indians from their longtime tribal homelands and then moving them en masse to what was called Indian Territory, near and part of what is today Oklahoma, as this map shows. Now, we need to talk briefly about an idea called sectionalism. Sectionalism is the idea that the United States is being broken up into two very different parts, not regions or places with different climates or different, one desert or forest, something like that, but sections One section that increasingly in the North is based on factories and wage labor, and the South, which is based on plantations and slave labor. And the issue of sectionalism comes to the forefront in the Missouri crisis of 1819. Now, since 1789 and the founding of the country, politicians tried very hard to keep the explosive issue of slavery beneath the surface of national life, not to talk about it. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 that we saw last time limited slavery north of the Ohio River. It allowed slavery to expand south of the river. So that is a sectional line, if you will, being drawn at the Ohio River. But Congress did not say anything about slavery in the vast Louisiana territory that President Jefferson purchased in 1803. And you can see in this map on your screen, that would be much of the green territory. And you can see in the yellow, it says MO, those are the initials for the state of Missouri. Now, Missouri applied for admission to the United States in 1819, and that opened the question of slavery in the territories one more time, because Missouri applied for admission as a slave state. And that set off a fierce debate inside the Congress over the question of whether or not Missouri would be allowed to enter the Union as a slave state or not. Now, this map shows us President James Monroe. He was the president who signed the Missouri Compromise in 1820. And of course, he went on, we will see, to some other important things in the country. Now, this map shows us the Missouri Compromise line. And you can see that the blue arrow there. Now, the compromise was complicated. You don't have to know all of the details. But what you should know is that that line on the southern border of Missouri, extending all the way to more or less where the Rocky Mountains are, that line, the 3630 line, was set up to allow slavery north of the line, no slavery north of the line except for Missouri, but to allow it south of the line. The Missouri Compromise then showed us that the United States was becoming sectionalized. That is, it was increasingly part of a country that had a northern section based on small farming, and also a southern section based on slave labor and plantation agriculture. So, now Missouri was allowed to come in as a slave state, and then Maine was allowed to come in as a free state. Maine was created by breaking off the eastern part of Massachusetts. Now, I don't know if you can see with this, my cursor up here, but on the Massachusetts was split off on the eastern side and Maine was created. That preserved the balance in the US Senate between free states and slave states. But the main point here is that the Missouri Compromise line increasingly sectionalizes the country into a northern section based on wage labor and a southern section based on slave labor. Now, this next point is fascinating to me because it talks about the northern economy and how it grows and becomes increasingly sectionalized or becomes increasingly different from the South. Now, we call this industrialization or the rise of a factory system. So we will look at economic growth and development in the northern states, how that occurred. How did the northern states grow economically, and how did they develop? First of all, the northern states had a lot of natural resources and they had a growing population, partly based on births inside the country, but also partly from immigration from outside the United States. This is a painting or a drawing of a major dock in New York City. Now, New York City was, of course, on the coast, and it had the ability by its location to engage in long-distance trade across the Atlantic. But it was very difficult. Let's just say that you're a merchant in New York City and you're bringing goods in from outside. You're importing from Europe, let's say, certain manufactured goods. How do you get those goods across the state of New York, or which is a very large state? Because the roads, the overland roads, are not very good, and they might be impassable at certain times of the year. So how do you have commerce and trade and business within the state of New York? Well, one idea was to build a canal, like a ditch, a large ditch with water that boats could go on. And you can see here that the idea is to connect the eastern side of New York, just a little bit up the Hudson River from New York City, and then connect it all the way over to the Great Lakes, where Buffalo is. So that canal would take traffic and goods and people all the way across the state of New York at a time where there were no roads and there was no river that went all the way from the east to the west. So this was a huge public works project to build a canal. In this case, it's called the Erie Canal. That canal would have been about a little over 360 miles, and it would increase traffic across the state of New York and build up commerce and business inside the state of New York. Plus, you can bring things to Buffalo, to the end of the canal, and then transport them back to New York City. This is a drawing of Lockport. Lockport is almost at the end of the western side of the canal, not far from Buffalo, at the western end of the Erie Canal. So you can see here the canal itself. It looks, of course, very small by modern standards, but you can see that there are boats down in the river. There's a large bridge. There are homes on either side. And then there are people ready to allow a boat to come through and then, take off the goods that are on it or load goods onto it. So the canal is very important because you need improved transportation. The canal, of course, was exceedingly important, and that canal made economic growth and expansion possible. And first there was the Erie Canal, and then they had hundreds of other smaller canals, not just in New York, but all across the eastern states. Also, there were railroads, and railroads provided inexpensive transportation for products to faraway markets. So if you can build a railroad across the state of New York, or you can build it from New York down to Philadelphia, and then beyond that to Washington, D.C., and so on, then you can transport to faraway markets. And those railroads, as they moved west, encouraged Americans to move west because it was a way to get back to the east if you were out in the west, and you could sort of move back and forth. And of course, those railroads also connected people in the east and the old Northwest Territory. So sort of, unifies or links people together. You can, this print here is called The First Locomotive, August 8th, 1829. You can see here people cheering as that old-fashioned railroad gets going there, but Americans really did cheer better, faster transportation for people and products to distant locations. And by distant, back then, 350 miles was a pretty long ways. And of course, the railroads just kept getting bigger and bigger. Railroads enabled producers to inexpensively transport their products to distant markets. Now, in a moment, we will see a map that shows eastern railroads that connect different states. The area we'll look at covers, well, the map itself covers area between Massachusetts and Virginia, and then west to the Mississippi River. It shows finished and proposed railroads. Now, this is a fascinating map because it shows the great faith Americans had in railroads. Now, I'll use my cursor here to help you, but in the upper right here, you can see Boston. Okay, so there's Boston right there. And you follow this cursor, it goes through Western Springfield, Massachusetts, and then it goes to Albany, New York, Utica, New York, and then through Syracuse, Rochester, all the way to Buffalo. That already existed. And then, of course, there are other railroads that are proposed. But this railroad ran alongside the Erie Canal, so you had two ways to get from, in this case, from Boston all the way to Buffalo. And then if you go back to Boston over here in the upper right-hand corner, you can see that a railroad swings down, and then it goes down. I'm sorry, let's start here at New York, okay? Now, New York's right, if you can see the cursor there. Now, New York, it starts here, goes down through Trenton, New Jersey, through Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, through Baltimore, and then down to Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. So that crosses multiple states in one line. And then, of course, they move further west. They go west from Washington, D.C., almost to the Mississippi River. This was just at the early stages. So railroads are very important. And the thing is, if you have improved transportation, then that stimulates or causes other growth. It causes farmers to grow more. It means that certain areas will specialize. You might have one area specializing in fruits. You might have another area specializing in grain, like wheat and oats and barley, because those farmers know that they can focus on one thing, like fruit, let's just say, and then they can put the fruit on a railroad car and then ship it to a port. If they can get it to the Mississippi River, then they can take it down even to New Orleans and beyond. They can take it out to the Caribbean, to Europe, to Latin America, and so on. So by the late 1830s, the old Northwest Territory, it would be Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, a lot of those states produced grains, while New England focused a lot on dairy and produce. Production soared, resulting in inexpensive, plentiful food for American workers, and of course, more income or more money for farmers to spend on consumer products. So it's sort of you tie together farming, transportation, and consumer goods, and the economy grows. Now, this map shows us, now you can follow my cursor here. You can see here, there's like a belt. If there's an area there, there's number 5, if you can see it on your screen, going down like that, all the way from Pennsylvania down into Missouri. And that would be an area that specializes in wheat, oats, rye, and barley. And then there's an area just above that in Illinois, and that area that produces a lot of corn. And you can see the corn, number 4, stretches across like that. So there is, and there are some areas that have apples and grapes, a lot of grapes up here in Illinois, in this area here. So transportation then allows farmers to focus on one thing because they know that they can grow that food, that one crop or 1 or 2 crops, and then ship them down river and market them to distant locations, and people will buy them who live in areas where that kind of thing can't be grown. It's amazing. Steamboat transportation made it easier for farmers in the Old Northwest to market their crops downriver. So, for instance, the Mississippi River goes as far north as what is today Duluth, Minnesota, almost. So if you have a steamboat, like you can see in this picture in front of St. Louis, then you can put items on those steamboats, and you can see all the steamboats stacked up there. And you load the steamboats, and then you can take those products as far away as there is demand for them. It's amazing. Now, another way that the country started to grow was by private investment, a lot of it. That is, capitalists, individuals with vast sums of money, or individuals with money coming together to pool that money, to put it together and then invest it in factories and other forms of investment. And of course, the government of the United States and different states as well do what they can to promote economic growth. Now, capital for internal improvements, for the exploitation of natural resources and the cultivation of new lands came from wealthy European investors and prosperous US merchants. In this particular case, let me move this a little bit up here so you can look at that. This map shows us the plan of the city of Lowell, Massachusetts. Lowell, Massachusetts became the center of the textile industry. The textile industry, of course, takes natural fiber, in this case, cotton, and it turns it into thread, and then turns it into yarn, and then spins and produces textiles to make clothing, to make housing, furnishings like tablecloths, and towels, and curtains, and you name it. All this was produced here at Lowell. And out of this grew what's called the Lowell system, that other textile locations in the United States copied. Private investment capital promoted economic growth in the early 19th century. Most of this was based on private investment. Individual investors or capitalists putting their money into Lowell. Lowell, Massachusetts had at least 13, and then later almost 30 textile mills within its city boundaries, made possible by the sizable financial investment of Francis Cabot Lowell and other wealthy investors who called themselves the Boston Associates. Their company, the Boston Manufacturing Company, controlled every aspect of life in Lowell, sometimes called a company town. In the early years, factory girls from surrounding areas were the main workers in the textile mills. But strikes by those women over deplorable working conditions and demand for higher wages led to strikes. And those strikes led the owners of those mills, sometimes called the lords of the loom, to replace New England women with Irish immigrants by the late 1830s, in the belief that immigrant women would make fewer complaints and be a more pliable labor supply. Lowell's mill owners processed Southern cotton, creating a very powerful alliance between the lords of the loom, Northern textile owners, and the lords of the lash or the whip, Southern slave owners. This is another picture of Lowell Mills. This is just one of the mills inside Lowell. This is a famous drawing called Bell Time. And you can see the men, the women, and the children going to work in those mills. And by the look on their faces, you can see that while they are not slaves, they are that they're being taken advantage of. They're working very long hours in very unsafe working conditions and for very small wages. We can see here that some of those individuals were very concerned about workers and tried to support labor strikes for higher wages, and they formed labor organizations to sort of help people unify around these labor questions. This is a masthead of one of those newspapers called The Voice of Industry. It was a labor newspaper founded in 1845 and published by an association of working men. And then a few years later, it was being published in Lowell. Now, another very important point is that the factory system that we see at Lowell spread all over the northern states. And we need to take a little bit closer look at how factories come into existence and why they do that. And the idea that we want to take a look at is called the reorganization of production. The reorganization of production. Now I've tried to put together an outline here. You can see it's, the drawing's a little informal, shall we say. But this chart, or this has three parts. This image has three parts. And let's take, I call it the reorganization of production in the northern states. And then there's before 1770, let's say. It's not a hard and fast divided line. Let's just say before 1770, and then 1780 to 1800, then after 1800. Now, there was a time when all production was by hand. Everything was made by hand. We call this the artisanal system of production. There were no factories in the beginning. Now, there were factories in Great Britain, but there were no factories in the United States. Everything was made by hand. So and the person that made something was called an artisan. Not an artist, but an artisan. And artisans made shoes, they made gloves, they made hats, they made fur coats. They're called furriers. They made gloves. They made rope. They made guns. They made locks, called the locksmith. There were blacksmiths. There were people that made teapots out of silver, called silversmith. Everything was made by hand. Now, on the left, you see sort of this drawing that I put here. This shows what it was like when things were made under the artisanal system of production, when artisans produced everything. Now you can see here that there's a house, and that's supposed to be an artisan, a craftsman, his family. There's the let's just say the shoemaker, the shoemaker's wife, and then the shoemaker children. That shoemaker was called a master, not a master in the sense of being a slave owner, but a master craftsman. a master shoemaker. And then you can see also that there in the back are, to the left of the house is his shop. And the shop is where the shoes are made. And then I show some apprentices there. Those are people who live with the master, and they are going through a system to become shoemakers themselves. And the master indentures them, signs a contract, and they work for 7 years usually, depending on the craft. And that apprentice or indentured servant in the North learns every aspect of shoe production. And then you become a journeyman about halfway through, and at the end of the time, you become a master shoemaker yourself. And then you go out, you open up a shop, and then you indenture people, and then they become masters like you. And this is how people became financially independent. They had a trade or a skill that could not be taken away from them. They were highly skilled workers. Now you can see on the left there, there's a rectangle there, like a square with circles inside. That's supposed to be looking down at the shop floor. And what it means is that those are the different steps of production. So 3 of those circles might represent, you know, if you imagine you were in a large room like that, 3 of those circles could be the raw hides sitting in the corner. And then you take those raw hides and then you dress the leather. You sometimes, because you have to make shoes for men, you have to make shoes for women, you have to make work shoes, or what they called Sunday going to meeting shoes. You had to make shoes for children, for teenagers, or for adults, different sizes. You had to make riding boots, you know. So that you had to, some leather would be soft, some would be hard. Then you had to tan the leather. That's another circle or two. You have to take the leather and color it. Some people liked white shoes, or maybe they liked blue shoes. So you would take dye, and then you would dye or tan the leather. And then you had to cut the leather. That's another couple of steps. Then you had to piece the leather together, and then put a sole on it, and then, you know, it's kind of a long process. And someone's already ordered the shoes, and they're just waiting for you to produce them. So it's not like you go into a store today, buy a pair of shoes, and walk out. These are called bespoke shoes. So you order a pair, and then you wait for them to come in. And believe it or not everybody wore shoes. A lot of people were poor and didn't have them. So this system was good. It made really high quality shoes and boots, and skilled individuals did the work. And so they had a livelihood. And you can see that the man and the wife both work at home. Now there's a sexual division of labor. The man is probably in the back as the shoemaker, of course, or in the front, the wife is educating her children. She's provisioning the household. She's doing almost all the buying. She's educating the children. She's out and about. So they both work. The man works at home and the woman works at home. And it's a complementary arrangement. They sort of each do different tasks, but they're both at home. And that was the way the system was for a long time in the northern states. But that changed because population growth means you need more shoes. And if the need for shoes or the demand for shoes is greater than the supply of shoes, then prices would start to go up. So a lot of shoemakers could not meet the demand. And so some of the more entrepreneurial-minded shoemakers decided to change the system a little bit to produce more shoes for greater numbers of people. And so you begin to see the development of a second system. The first system still exists, but there's a shift, a slow shift away. And we call this the putting out system. Today they would call this outsourcing. So in this case, the artisan or the shoemaker doesn't make as many of the shoes as he once did. Instead, he puts out the production into the community to people that know how to do it. So let's say, now you can see in that middle diagram, it says, you can see here that there are, I've circled 3 of these steps of production, and an arrow says to a worker in his house, another 2 go to the worker in his house. And so he in other words, everything that he used to do in his shop, he now sends out to people in the community. And the master, the shoemaker is sort of like something like an organizer. He has a wagon, and he goes to the first house and picks up all the leather that's been dressed or softened or whatever. And then he picks it up and drops off another load and takes the first load to the next person who's going to tan the leather. And then drops off another load, and then takes that over to the next person who's going to cut the leather. So he's sort of like the person who keeps all the plates spinning, if you will. But he does less and less of the work himself, but he oversees the work, and he probably has fewer helpers or fewer apprentices, maybe just 1. And that's a good system. You still have pretty good shoes. They are of acceptable quality, and the price is still reasonable. But there's still more demand and more need for shoes than the putting out system can produce. So the final system is what we call a factory system. Here, a large building is built, usually in an inland area where there's water, so you can have a water wheel or power supply. The water hits the wheel, then generates power in the wheelhouse, and so on. You can see here that all the steps of production have been brought back under one roof, but here you can see that you have all the steps, you have many more steps broken up like that, and made into just one small little step, and then a worker over each step. And this system was very successful in the sense that it made a lot of shoes of acceptable quality at substantially lower prices for more people. It seemed like a good situation. There's only one main problem, or several main problems. First of all, the workers in a factory only learn one step of production. They don't learn every step of production. So they have been de-skilled. They're no longer skilled workers. They're, for the most part, unskilled workers because they just do one thing. And you can easily train someone to replace that person. The other thing is that they no longer are independent artisans. Now they are dependent wage workers. So instead of having a skill, like being a shoemaker, now they're a wage worker. And so they have been stripped, as it were, or de-skilled, and their skills are no longer necessary. So increasingly everything that was made by hand is now made by factory. So the individual craftspeople are no longer needed. So that system of the artisanal production is wiped out. So it was and skilled workers are reduced to unskilled. Skilled artisans are reduced or turned into unskilled wage workers. This is what sociologists and economists call de-skilling, or taking away somebody's skill. De-skilling means that a once skilled trade becomes an unskilled or semi-skilled job because new technology can undermine worker skills. Shoemaking was once a skilled trade, but mass production of shoes in a factory made artisanal shoemakers obsolete and unnecessary. The factory system de-skilled many workers and killed most artisanal handmade crafts or trades. One sociologist has suggested that the strategy of employers or companies was to reduce the skills required in their production processes, often by means of new technology which simplified tasks. The possession of skills had provided workers with power to resist managerial domination at work because skilled workers were in short supply on the labor market, because production systems could not function without their expertise. Some modern day examples of de-skilling would be self-checkout at a grocery store or a retail store instead of using a skilled cashier. Another example would be heavy-duty staple guns, using those instead of using a carpenter with a hammer and a nail. And of course, as you know, the process of de-skilling continues. So the factory system had many good benefits, but it had serious effects because it de-skilled workers and took away their independent livelihoods. This is an example of men and women working at home. As this painting called An Iron Forge shows us, blacksmiths worked at home as skilled artisanal craftsmen before industrialization turned ironworking into a factory-based production process. So everything that was made at home increasingly was made in a factory. Before the rise of the factory system, men and women both worked at home, although, as we have seen, there was a sexual division of labor. And here the blacksmith's wife brings the children into the shop where there's a heavy furnace, or there's a forge and a fire, and you can see the intense heat. This, as we will see, led to an idea called the domestic sphere, or the sphere of the woman. Before the rise of the factory system, men and women both worked at home. While women provisioned the household and educated the children, men were skilled craftsmen making consumer goods by hand in a domestic shop in the back of the house. Products made in factories gradually replaced products made by hand as men left their shops to work in factories. With time, factory work was seen as the man's sphere, or the man's area, and the home came to be seen as the sphere of a woman, or the woman's area. So the idea that a woman's place was at home and the man's place was at work came because of industrialization. Industrialization, or the rise of the factory system, encouraged people to believe that men and women worked outside the home, that men worked outside the home and women worked inside the home. The home, as this illustration shows us, was exclusively the woman's sphere. But that was a new development caused by industrialization. It had not been that way before, when men and women both worked at home. This one more picture, a painting actually, you can see here a painting of New York City in 1836. And you can see the growth that's taking place here in the streets, on the sidewalks, in the buildings. Commercial seaports like New York City expanded steadily, grew steadily, and developed diversified manufacturing to supplement commercial services. So they had banks and they had warehouses and things related to the port and the dock. But they also had increasingly manufacturing there too. With the completion of the Erie Canal, New York became the nation's largest import-export center, being able to bring things in, and distribute them, and collect things and send them out. At that point showed us the North. the northern states, how they were developing. This point shows us how the southern states are developing, because the northern states are going in one direction, the southern states in another, because of sectionalism. Now, first of all, let's talk about slavery and the Old South. Now, slavery in the Old South means slavery, well, the Old South means the South before the Civil War. So this is slavery before the Civil War in the Old South, in the southern states before the Civil War. Now, we just need to point out briefly that when people think about the South, they tend to think that the South is just an area with large cotton plantations run by slaves. And of course, there were many plantations run by slaves. But that is sort of a myth or an idea that isn't actually true. The fact is, the South was very diverse as a region. It included a number of different geographic regions. It grew a wide variety of crops, and it had cities as well as plantations. But it is true that slavery was the one crucial institution that more than any other defined what this Old South was. Now this is just just a picture of a plantation. But the South, of course, is not merely a plantation society, but some movies and novels and have promoted the idea that that's what it was. Now on the right, this is a mansion that from a picture from 2019 that shows that a mansion that was in a famous movie called Gone with the Wind. Let me move this down a little bit so you can get a better picture of that. There's the plantation as it looked in 2019. You can see in the photograph on the left that this was the mansion that inspired the movie years ago. And you can see, of course, it was run down. They fixed it up. Now it's sort of a tourist attraction, but that's what we call a plantation manor. And these, of course, slave owners took great pride in building these large houses in this sort of plantation style. Now there's our map again, but what I want to show you this time is the South. Now the South is a very diverse region. And you can see in the right here, this fisherman in a boat. That actually is right off that's actually Virginia there. So there's Virginia, there's Maryland, and then North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and so on. Now you can see here, if you can follow my cursor, there's sort of this light blue color here. That's a cotton belt that goes all the way from the Carolinas really into Oklahoma and down into Texas. Right. Now, so that cotton, of course, was the major crop. But you'll notice in the upper South, you have other crops here. You have corn. In this area here, you have wheat, oat, and barley. And then you have a little bit of sugar cane here in Louisiana. And then you come down here, you have in the South, you have apples, pears, peaches, you have grapefruit. So the South is a very diverse region. Cotton clearly is the defining region, but there are a lot of other areas. There's the deep South, there's the upper South, like Tennessee and Kentucky, and so on. So it's a very diverse region. It's not just one crop. But of course, cotton was the main crop. Now, the South, the economy of of the southern states grew even faster than the North, the economy of the North in the 20 years before the Civil War. So in other words, we've already seen that the northern economy, because of canals and railroads and manufacturing, is growing at a very rapid rate. Well, the South is growing even faster, at least from about 1840 to 1860. And most of that is because of cotton and because of the invention of the cotton gin. Now, here's a photograph of a cotton plant. And you can see the cotton balls there. And you pick the balls, and of course, inside the balls is a lot of seed. So you have to take the seeds out. The cotton gin was a very important invention. This is a picture of the application for the cotton gin filed by Eli Whitney. And the cotton gin combs the cotton and removes the seeds without breaking the fiber. So when you comb the cotton and take the seeds out, it's called combed cotton. That machine, which was improved upon, so you can see here's a larger one. You can see it at an old plantation in Georgia. The cotton gin allowed farmers to replace long staple cotton, which had few seeds, with a short staple variety that had a lot of seeds. But as one planter said, it grew like a weed because it no longer mattered how many seeds there were. So you can grow short staple cotton everywhere. And it can be grown all across the South. And so increasingly, the Southern economy was tied to or connected to the growth of cotton. Now, part of the reason for the demand for cotton was because England had a lot of factories long before the United States ever did. In this map, you can see major areas of woolen cloth production in mid-18th century England. That would be around 1750s or so. The blue areas, you can see down here, Norwich, around Bath, Exeter, and so on. Those blue areas are where English industrialists built factories to process woolen cloth. Now, wool, of course, comes from sheep who have their wool shorn or cut off. But these industrialists wanted these textile mills to operate year-round and be more profitable. So many of them processed wool and then cloth. So there's a strong demand for cloth. And the United States South stepped up to meet that demand, particularly after the cotton gin was invented. Here you can see the inside of a textile mill where cotton's being produced. You can see the pulleys there, which suggests that this is located by water somewhere where there's power to turn the wheel and to create power in the wheelhouse, and then you can pull a lever and the looms move. Slavery, of course, was the main labor force used to process cotton. As cotton cultivation moved into the western states, from South Carolina into Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and so on, more slave labor was needed, and slavery became more deeply embedded in Southern life. While more acres of corn were actually grown in the South, cotton was the largest cash crop. And after 1820, the United States, the southern states, the South, was the world's largest producer of cotton. And after about 1815, cotton represented more than half of all US exports abroad. Now, cotton, here you can see, here you can see where it's produced in the South. Four out of every 100 bales of cotton stayed in the South for domestic use, but 22% of all cotton, that means 22 out of every 100 bales went to a northern state to be processed in a textile mill. So that's 26%. The remaining 74% all went to Europe. There's a tremendous demand for cotton in European textile mills, because Europe, for the most part, is too cold to grow cotton. And you can see on this map that Great Britain or England uses almost half of all exports. The strong support in Europe for cotton and for slavery that produced the cotton. Now, cotton was sort of like, we call it like an octopus. It reached out, and the octopus reaches out and puts its tentacle on something and pulls it back in. It sucks it in like that. And cotton was sort of like that. In other words, cotton fueled the growth of northern textile mills. Northern textile mills, the lords of the loom, made business arrangements with southern slaveholders, lords of the lash or the whip, to purchase slave-produced cotton. You can see on these maps here, or these charts, each of those dots represents a textile mill. The greater the size of the dot, the greater the capacity of that mill to produce cotton. You can see in 1810, there are a lot of dots in the northern states, and a few are large. But notice in 1840, there are a lot more dots with much greater size. And as we said, northern states purchased about 22% of all southern cotton, primarily for use in textile mills that produce cotton fabrics, clothing, household goods, and countless other products. Now consider this map, which I think is very revealing. Let's move this out of the way a little bit. This shows the cotton textile industry by number of employees, 1839. So the larger the dot, the more workers there are. Now notice Lowell there that we looked at. Lowell is right here, sort of in the center, just north of Boston. There's a huge circle there. That means that at Lowell and surrounding area, just in Lowell itself, there are at least 3,000 people who work in those mills. That's a lot of jobs. So you put all these jobs together, you're talking a lot of Northerners who work in textile mills, working with cotton that was produced by slaves. Professor Thomas Dublin said that by 1850, New England's textile workforce had grown to number at least 85,000 people. That's a lot of workers, producing cloth goods valued at $68 million annually. And that would be in 1850 dollars. This total does not include textile workers in the state of Pennsylvania. So you're looking at a lot of workers there. So you can see there is strong support in the northern states for southern slavery because everyone works with cotton. And again, you can see some of those 85,000 textile workers and the looks on their faces. New England factory life. Now, slavery is the primary workforce behind cotton. Cotton is based on slave labor. And so as cotton grows in profitability, Southern planters want to move west and have more cotton farms, more plantations. So Southerners start to migrate or move west in huge numbers between 1830 and 1860, pushing Native Americans out of the Southeast and pushing Mexicans out of Texas, or what is today Texas. Southerners were attracted by fresh lands, by cheap labor, and they were pushed west by worsening economic conditions and exhausted lands. And as they moved west, they carried their values and their institutions of slavery with them. The problem is that when you move west, there still isn't enough slave labor for the new slave states of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, and so on. Texas later. There just aren't enough slaves. And so what begins to happen is that slaveholders find ways to get more slaves. Now, let's just take a look at this, for example. Now, you can see on the left, here's a map of Southern slavery in 1821. Each of those dots represents a location where at least 1,000 bales of cotton were produced in a single year. And then notice the map on the right that shows how slavery is spread by 1859. There are many more dots in many more locations. And in some areas in the heartland, inside Alabama, inside Mississippi, and parts of Louisiana, there's so much cotton production. There's like solid black marks. And you need slaves to do all of this work. So where do they get the slaves? Well, they get them from the old tobacco producing regions of the Chesapeake, Virginia, Maryland, maybe parts of North Carolina and parts of Delaware. So you can see here that you see the arrows from the north moving down to the south. So you can have slaves coming from Kentucky down through Nashville to Memphis, down the Mississippi River to somewhere in Mississippi. Or you can see slaves from Wilmington, Delaware, and Norfolk, Virginia, put on barges like this. See that cursor there if you can, coming around on ships, and then being sold into Pensacola or Mobile slave ports across the Gulf South. We call this the internal or domestic slave trade. That is, so-called excess slaves from the Upper South are trafficked into the cotton states because the demand for slaves is so high. And the numbers of slaves in the Chesapeake is so excessive. So, and this is a tremendously violent, if you will, period of history, because there were slaves on plantations in Virginia and Maryland that, while they were slaves, did have some longevity. They had been slave families for, on a single plantation, who knows, for 7 or 8 generations. And suddenly, slaves are designated as excess and unnecessary. And these families are broken up and suctioned off like a heavy industrial vacuum cleaner might do, ripped away from their families and trafficked into the Cotton South. It's a horrible episode. This is a drawing from a sketchbook of landscapes in the state of Virginia. It shows 2 men on horseback leading a group of 20 slave men, women, and children who are being forced to walk barefoot from Virginia to Tennessee. in the internal slave trade, the domestic slave trade. This point is called economic dependence on slavery. It's designed to show us and to remind us that the South became very, very dependent on slavery economically. Between 1820 and 1860, the number of slaves in the southern United States nearly tripled. And by 1860, there were almost 4 million slaves in the American South, up from about 1.3 million slaves 40 years before. Most of those slaves worked on plantations and farms, but increasingly they were found in every sector of the Southern economy and in many different occupations. In 1847, this company right here, Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, Virginia, it made iron products, including artillery and iron plates for the sides of ships. In 1847, this company, which was sort of one of the few factories in the South which never industrialized, this company shifted from white workers to slave labor in order to destroy the potential of organized white workers to strike. In other words, blacks were used as strike breakers. And then when this threat strike passed, then more agreeable white workers were brought in to take those jobs. Now we're fast forwarding a little bit here, but I want you to see, this document that describes what happened in 1919, which was only about 70 years later, because there was a steel strike. Steel workers went on strike in the fall of 1919, and it shut down half the steel mills in the United States. And when the American Federation of Labor struck or went on strike against U.S. Steel in the fall of 1919, shutting down half the steel mills in the country, management or the companies used every dirty trick available to them. It smeared the union leaders in the press by calling them communists, or Reds, or Bolsheviks. It derided or talked badly about striking workers because they were immigrants. And the company encouraged local and state militia to intimidate, harass, and even fire upon workers. But notice this sentence. The original race card players, steel mill owners, brought in 30,000 to 40,000 African Americans and Mexican Americans as strike breakers and taunted the locked out strikers for losing their good white jobs. So blacks, and in this case, Mexican Americans, African Americans and Mexican Americans have been used as strike breakers. That's what companies do sometimes. Not all companies, but in this case, steel mill owners or Tredegar Iron Works. Another important point is that while the southern states grew tremendously through cotton and the growth of the cotton industry, the South did not grow as it might have grown under a system of free labor. Or to put it another way, slave labor and cotton production stunted economic growth in the South. The South grew a lot, but it would have grown a lot more had it not used slave labor. Now, let me explain this chart that I tried to make here, that I made. Let's hope that I made it understandable. Now, economic growth normally follows a certain path, a typical path. The northern states pretty much did this. First, the northern states started out as agricultural or farming states. And then there were improvements in farming, or better methods and greater crop yields and more crops available and so on, a diversity of crops. Then that leads to industrialization. Industrialization in turn leads to the growth of large cities. So farms get bigger and more specialized. Then you have a factory or industrial system, and then factories lead to the growth of large cities. That's a typical path. That's what happened in the North. But in the South, it didn't happen like that, because Southern planters and Southern leaders did not really want to go to the second step of economic growth. Instead of going from agricultural improvement and specialization or agricultural growth to a factory system, they deliberately would not go to the second step. That's why there's an X through it. And you can see the line, the arrow sort of comes back on itself. That is, Southern leaders wanted more cotton and more cotton and more cotton. They didn't want to go to an industrialized system. They had Tredegar if they needed anything, otherwise they're fine, they thought. Professor Gary Nash from UCLA wrote these words: typically, agricultural improvements lead to industrialization and urbanization, but this was not the case in the South. While some Southerners, such as the editors of DuBose Review, called for greater economic independence through diversified agriculture, meaning not just cotton, industrial development and transportation improvements, most were content to continue as they were. So the South grew, but not nearly as it might have otherwise grown. So slavery slowed down or inhibited economic growth. It didn't encourage it, at least in the normal way. Now, this point, slavery and class, is just designed to show us what the Southern states looked like in terms of class. Who were the wealthy, who were the poor? Now you can see here that the South is divided up into two main sectors, two parts. Those who hold slaves, 1 out of every 4 Southerners owned slaves, and then those who didn't own slaves. That's 3 out of 4. Among the slaveholding class, the large planters who owned 50 slaves or more were at the very top. They held most of the political power and economic power in the South. And then those small planters who owned between 10 and 50 slaves made up about 20% of the slaveholding class. Most of the slaveholding class, 7 out of every 10 slaveholders, probably had between 1 and 9 slaves. So they had a little less power, of course. But most Southerners did not own slaves. 3 out of every 4 did not. The yeoman farmers, of course, were people who had small farms. Sometimes they didn't own slaves, but they were very anti-Black. They lived in the foothills. The land that they worked on was not as good a quality as what the slaveholding class held. Many of them were self-sufficient. They raised or made almost everything they needed. They had some political power, but they didn't challenge the slaveholding planters for power. And during the Civil War, most of them fought for the Confederacy. But below all of them are the poor whites. These people lived in very isolated, inhospitable areas. They sort of scratched out a living from the soil. They maybe raised a few pigs, hunted small game like rabbit and things like that. Many of them made corn whiskey. Some of them hired themselves out as farm hands. Because of a poor diet and bad living conditions, they often suffered from disease, and they stayed poor in part because the slave system allowed the planters or the slaveholders to accumulate a lot of power, much more than they otherwise would have had. So with so much power concentrated in the slaveholding class, it limited the opportunities of the vast majority of whites. Now, it's important to point out that when slavery grows, slaveholders and the country at large really found ways to justify what they were doing. Because slavery grew dramatically, as we've seen, and tripled. The number of slaves tripled between 1820 and the eve of the Civil War in 1860. Now, before the 1830s, most slaveholders had said that slavery was a necessary evil. That means it was sort of there were problems with it. It was inconsistent with liberty. Many even thought slavery might die, at least before the development of the cotton gin. But as we will see, the abolitionists, the anti-slavery supporters, people that tried to abolish slavery, started to increasingly attack slaveholders, call them immoral, sinful, and slaveholders increasingly felt that it was necessary to justify what they were doing. And as you can see in the lower right here, it says, after the rise of the abolitionist movement in the 1830s, slaveholders started to defend slavery as a positive good. They said it's not a necessary evil. Because you see, if something's a necessary evil, means it's wrong, but you have to do it. Right? A classic example of a necessary evil would be something like war. People say war is wrong, but sometimes it's necessary. That's one example. But the slaveholders said no. After the 1830s, after they were under attack, they said, slavery's not wrong, it's good. It's a really positive development. And then they used four basic arguments to say that slavery was good, to justify what they were doing. The first of these we call the biblical so-called argument. Many slaveholders called themselves Christians, and I'm of course in no position to judge whether they were or weren't. But in fact, research that I have done showed that even in Boston, the heartland of Puritanism, at least 4 out of every 10 pastors in Boston between 1630 and 1776, at least 4 out of every 10 pastors owned slaves themselves. And when they did it, the people said, well, we can do it too. And as early as 1700, a judge in Massachusetts named Samuel Sewall urged his fellow colonists, others in Massachusetts, to abandon slavery and their religious justification for enslaving people. And he published this pamphlet called The Selling of Joseph, a Memorial. And Samuel Sewall, who was a very important member of that colony of Massachusetts, said this: originally and naturally, there is no such thing as slavery. Joseph, the son of biblical Jacob, was rightfully no more a slave to his brethren than they were to him. And they had no more authority to sell him than they had to slay him. Sewall anticipated and carefully refuted the various religious justifications for slavery that Puritans in Massachusetts used. So there were professing Christians who went to church every Sunday, who were slaveholders and who justified slaveholding. This is a much more vicious and racist defense of slavery using the Bible. In 1852, a man named Josiah Priest made selective use of Bible verses to defend Southern slavery in his pseudo-scientific book, or falsely scientific book, that claims God created black people to be slaves. Now, this was an extreme use of the Bible, but there were people who believed it. That's one. So some people justified slavery as a positive good by saying the Bible says it's okay. Another argument was the historical argument. Some people said that the slavery had existed throughout history, all the way back to the beginning. There was slavery in Greece and in Rome, in the Mesopotamian states, in Egypt. They said the greatest civilizations of the world had built their strength and grandeur on slave labor. So therefore, they said, if the United States wanted to be great, it would have to use slavery too. This is a mosaic showing two female slaves attending their mistress, their owner, in Carthage, North Africa. Now, this would be in modern Tunisia during the ancient Roman Empire. And so many Americans looked at something like this, if they were to see it or hear about it, see a drawing, and they would say, look how ancient Rome used slaves. It made them great, it'll make us great too. That's the historical so-called justification for slavery. Another argument that had a great deal of truth in it was the constitutional argument. The United States Constitution, in at least three ways, strengthened slavery. The first was the slave trade clause. The slave trade is different from slavery. The slave trade means that you can import slaves or traffic them in. And the Congress of the United States, when the Constitution was approved, protected the slave trade for the importation of slaves for 20 years before it could be outlawed. That is, it allowed it to exist for 20 additional years. One historian of the slave trade wrote this: during the 20 years between 1787 and 1808, when Congress finally banned the slave trade, thousands of Africans were brought into the southern states. More slaves entered the United States during these 2 decades than during any other 20 years in American history. Such numbers helped fuel the westward expansion of the slave system. In other words, this 20-year window that allowed more slaves to come in before the window shut was the greatest intake. It wasn't the last sip. It was the greatest gulp ever in the history of the United States. A second clause in the United States Constitution that strengthened slavery was the Fugitive Slave Clause, or the Runaway Slave Clause. Now, the language here is a little seemingly imprecise. No person held to service or labor in one state, of the laws thereof escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, it shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. This clause was the basis for the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793, and then the updated Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Those laws allowed slaveholders to pursue slaves across state lines, capture them with help from a U.S. Marshal, and then bring the suspected runaway before a federal magistrate or judge who was empowered to return the fugitive to the slaveholder. Northern courts even in states, excuse me, let me move this out of the way. Even in states where slavery was dead or dying, were forced to uphold Southern slavery. And many of the so-called fugitives were not fugitives at all. They were free blacks, people who had been born free and were mistakenly identified or designated as runaways and then enslaved and returned to a South where they had never lived. The Fugitive Slave Acts allowed slaveholders to pursue escaped slaves across state lines with help from bounty hunters or slave catchers, as you can see in this illustration, where bounty hunters are using bloodhounds, guns, and horses to pursue a runaway or a fugitive slave. And here's an actual advertisement. There were thousands of them for a runaway slave from 1838. And believe me, that reward of $150 back then would be very high now. We won't analyze it in great detail, but you can see that the slave is described in very great detail. So it's very easy to identify the person. And then the third clause was a 3/5 clause that gave Southern states greater political representation in the House of Representatives. The historian Gary Wills from Northwestern University wrote this: the 3/5 clause, sometimes called the federal ratio, gave Southern states enormous political power in the government of the United States. The slave states always had 1/3 more seats in Congress than their free population warranted. For example, in 1833, the Southern states had 98 US members of Congress, remember, 98 congressmen instead of the 73 they would otherwise have been entitled to. Between 1798 and 1850, slaveholders controlled the presidency for 50 years, the Speaker's chair for 41 years, and chairmanship of the House Ways and Means Committee, the most important committee, for 42 years. The only men to be ever re-elected president in that period, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Jackson, were all slaveholders. Those who sat in the Speaker's chair the longest, Henry Clay, Andrew Stevenson, and Nathaniel Macon, were slaveholders, and 18 out of 31 Supreme Court justices were slaveholders. All because of the 3/5 ratio, or for the most part. And the last defense, of course, was a so-called sociological defense. George Fitzhugh, a defender of Southern slavery across racial lines, argued that Southern slaves were treated than wage laborers in Northern factories. Quote, he said, the unrestricted exploitation of so-called free society is more oppressive to the laborer or worker than domestic slavery. You can see how he defended this view. On the left, you see a worker that's injured himself, maybe lost an arm or a hand, being carried away from a factory and taken to the poorhouse. And it says, attention paid a poor, sick white man. But then in the lower part, you can see a slave who's sick, and it says, attention paid a poor, sick slave or Negro, an old word for African American. And this illustration would have you believe that when a slave gets sick, the master's very concerned, brings him soup, prays for him, and is very solicitous of his well-being. There may have been a case like that, I don't know, but the point he's trying to say is it's better, you're going to get better treatment as a Southern slave than as a wage slave in a Northern factory. And while it's true that Northern factories were oppressive, if you were to ask a slave where he or she wanted to be, they would most certainly say they preferred to be in a society where they were not slaves and they could choose to work in a factory or maybe be a craftsman or whatever. But to say that slavery is preferable to working in a factory is hard to believe, but yet people believed it. So to summarize, the defense of slavery, the growth of slavery, ran counter to most thinking of the 19th century. In the United States, many people were thinking about individual liberty, mobility, economic opportunity, democratic political participation. Planters didn't think along these lines. And the way they avoided any sort of uprising was they maintained solidarity between themselves and poor whites. Upper class whites and poor whites were all united around the idea that they had better have solidarity within their group lest they be overtaken by a group that was enslaved. That would be African Americans. The justification that underlay all the other justifications really was profit. And the other point we should mention in conclusion is that maybe the worst feature of slavery was maybe not even physical, as bad as that was, but perhaps even psychological, because in a society that supposedly valued equality and liberty, to be thought of as inferior and unequal was a slander and a slur, a libel against African Americans. And in the next lecture, we will see how abolitionists and others tried to turn this around and bring an end to this system that was so deeply entrenched. I truly appreciate your attention. I hope the lecture was interesting and informative, and I encourage you to go back over certain parts and play the lecture again for clarification if you need it, and please feel free to email me if you have any questions. Thank you very, very kindly.